like this is one of my most favorite graphs to show ever. So along the
It
axes,
looks confusing.
Well, the
Is that why you like
here,
to show it? Just to prove that you're
no,
smart?
no. It to me, it describes the simplicity of training zones and the simplicity of the threshold, right? So there's all these different names that we can use to represent the threshold, but they're all kind of happening at about the same intensity. So if we go across the bottom, oxygen consumption. So we know a certain amount of oxygen. We need a certain amount of oxygen to do a certain amount of work. So this could easily be transferred at the bottom for power output along the bottom.
Or pace or swim speed.
Yes. So you can imagine as your pace gets higher, your blood lactate concentration and your volume of expired gas increases, your VO2 goes up, and that's what we'd expect as the work gets harder. So as you go harder, lactate starts to accumulate because you lose the buffering capacity because there's just too much of it because you're going too hard.
So that's the yellow graph.
Yep. And at a certain point, the clearance, the accumulation exceeds the clearance and it starts to build up. And that first point where it happens is called the point of lactate threshold. Lactate threshold, pretty much your FTP, right? And we go up a little bit more and the blood lactate concentration can exceed 4 millimoles per liter, and that's called onset of blood lactate. And what you can see, and the important thing to note here, is they both happen around 3 liters per minute of oxygen uptake. And then if we go up to the next line, the red one, that's volume of expired gas. And you can see the ventilatory threshold there, the first one. It's happening about the same intensity of the lactate threshold. And the respiratory compensation point, which is happening about the same point as OBLA.
As a practical reference, I like to say respiratory compensation point is the point is where you can't hold a conversation comfortably. You know, you're like, yeah. Oh, yeah, cool.
Yeah, so this is pretty much how every group exercise ends up about 20 minutes in, right?
Yeah, about top of zone 3, bottom of zone 4 on the easy bunch ride.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone's still going easy. They finish their easy ride with a bunch of Strava crowns. Right?
Yeah, and FTP increase notifications.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I love this graph because it shows that all of these thresholds, even though we have lots of fancy words for them, they all represent the same point. So that's why it's really important for me to just pick one and stick with it.
Yeah, imagine if you'd figured this out before you went and did that study.
Like if I was actually interested in aerobic metabolism before I did that study, yeah. I probably wouldn't have gotten the publication because I wouldn't have done the research. So.
That's fair enough.
My first pro tip is, even though there's tons of different ways we can test, stick with one way to test. And the other beautiful thing about training peaks is that it keeps track of these different power peaks for us. So for example, 5 seconds and 1 minute, we know 5 seconds is probably representing our PCR system. So if we want to improve our ability there, we can track it just by looking at our 5-second power. We can test it specifically, or we can look at it in races. So it's the same as we go across. So as we get to 20 minutes, we know that that's starting to represent more aerobic ability. 60 minutes is definitely aerobic ability. So I stick with the 20-minute test or a set benchmark test. Not every athlete has a good place to test for 20 minutes. So we find a test and stick with it. And then we look at what Training Peaks gives us for the power profile.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll use a chart like this. If we're in amongst a race season, you don't need a test all the time if an athlete's doing a race in which you can clearly see using this graph and these profiles that their power is improving, their fitness is improving. Maybe they're not doing as well in a race, but that could be a pacing related situation. But you can at least go, okay, I'm not going to thrash you over 20 minutes. I can see we're tracking in the right direction.
Yeah. Like if you already had your PB for 20 minutes last week, like you're not going to test it again. Like what's the point? Right.
Yeah. Dr. Matt and I started the Performance Advantage podcast to help runners, riders, and outdoor competitors integrate sports science more effectively into their training and racing.
So over the last few years, Dr. Will and I have covered topics like the lactate threshold, training zones, power meters, and fatigue. Now we're condensing these popular and misunderstood topics into practical courses.
Our courses take our same podcasting style approach to learning and education, and we break it down into bite-sized chunks that you can digest either all at once or as practical little resources to use as and when you need them.
So the biggest difference between our course and any other course you might have taken is that we don't lecture you. It's a conversation between Will and I, and we're explaining complex sports science principles in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah, we also integrate how we use them on the regular. Our courses come with a certificate of completion, as well as a lot of takeaway resources such as training plans, scientific articles, and quizzes that you can do to check your progress along the way.
Our sports science courses are available now. Register on performanceadvantagepodcast.com for immediate access.